Story number 1. I used to think danger announced itself with warning signs. It doesn't. It smiles, offers a lift, and knows exactly how far the next town isn't. The duct tape didn't make the loudest sound that night. My own certainty tearing was louder. You can learn a stranger's name in a heartbeat. You learn their inventory later. The loneliest road in America is only lonely until someone decides you shouldn't be alone. If I ever pray, it's to fluorescent lights and paperwork. The saints that made sure I walked out of Nevada, breathing. The most terrifying thing about accepting help from a stranger isn't what they might do to you. It's realizing you've been walking straight into their trap from the very beginning. I didn't write that in a journal later. I felt it as surely as pavement under my shoes. I learned this lesson on a stretch of Highway 50 in Nevada. A ribbon of asphalt whispering that civilization lay somewhere just out of reach. My name is Jason, and by the end of this, I'll sound older than I am. We left Sacramento soft with optimism and coffee, cutting toward Reno before the sun had a chance to burn the hopeful off our faces. Jamie handled the playlist. I handled the wheel. The arrangement worked because I liked her terrible taste, and she liked the way my hands steadied at 75. We were writing a story about to be written, the kind of story where couples test distances and come back with inside jokes and photographs to frame. We were driving from Sacramento to Denver to visit her sister, taking the scenic route through Nevada because Jamie loved photographing desert landscapes. It wasn't just landscapes. She loved patience made visible, abandoned diners, flaked paint on gas pumps, a sky so wide it felt like a kept promise. She carried her grandfather's Canon as if it were an heirloom compass. She had this old Canon camera that belonged to her grandfather, and sometimes she'd hold it up to the window and breathe as if the glass were a lung. We ate in Reno because the waitress called everyone hon, without measuring who deserved it. We tipped too much and laughed just enough. The trip started perfectly. We left early on a Friday morning, stopped for breakfast in Reno, and the day stretched out like a desert road you could almost believe would never end. We were laughing, singing along to her terrible road trip playlist, and talking about maybe doing more trips like this. I planned futures in the rearview, little promises I kept meaning to say out loud. The first sign wasn't the noise. It was the way the car felt like a sentence that planned to fragment. The problem started around 4 in the afternoon, about 30 minutes east of Fallon. A vibration translated up through the steering column, tatting my nerves into lace. Our 2019 Honda Civic started making this grinding noise that got worse with every mile. Jamie suggested we stop. I suggested we trust momentum. It was a democracy of two, and I was the louder vote. We pulled over when the transmission slipped like a hand losing grip. The desert had perfected indifference. No buildings, no other cars, no cell service, just endless desert in every direction. We opened the hood and stared into the organ we did not understand. But honestly, neither of us knew the first thing about car repair. Out there, ignorance echoed. Headlights braided themselves through that echo. Relief is an emotion with weight. It settled on my shoulders as a pickup rolled to a kindly stop behind us. Hazard lights blinking like conversation starters. He was in his 50s, built like work, smile tidy as a helpful brochure. He introduced himself as Dale and said he ran a garage back in Fallon. He spoke the language of bolts and belts, made those thoughtful throat sounds people make when they want you to see competence, the way you'd see a badge. He told us what we didn't want to hear, with the warmth of someone breaking bad news softly. "Your transmission's shot," he said. "This car isn't going anywhere without a tow truck." He added the hope right after, the way a pharmacist adds water with the pill. "But don't worry, I can give you folks a ride back to town." It felt like a lifeline disguised as hospitality. Jaime relaxed her shoulders the way you loosen a knot when it meets reason. We locked the Civic, as if the desert were capable of theft. His truck was the kind with a bench seat, old enough to have memories of its own, clean enough to have been chosen by a man who respected his tools. Jaime sat between us, softening the geometry of trust. He talked about desert wildlife and the railroad's ghost. He named valleys as if they were friends. It was a tour wrapped around a rescue. 15 minutes became a question I couldn't stop asking. The sun was retreating, which meant our direction shouldn't have felt like retreat as well. The sun was setting behind us, and with it went my confidence. I mentioned Fallon, the way a person mentions a safe word. He swallowed it with a smile. "Shortcut," he said. "Faster this way." Asphalt turned to a thinner kind of reassurance, the cracked whine of a road that remembered better budgets. Jaime's hand found mine. Her pulse wrote a telegram to my skin. "This doesn't look like the way to town," Jaime said quietly. The truck's cab cooled several degrees as his face altered like a door shutting. The friendliness folded itself and put itself away. His voice slid into the register predators use to soothe their own certainty. He told us to stay calm and that everything would be over soon. The words sat beside us, heavy and impolite. We turned off asphalt. Dirt found us. Outcroppings shouldered up on both sides, and ahead was the skeleton of a mining camp, abandoned when prosperity moved zip codes. There were a few dilapidated buildings scattered around, some rusted equipment, and piles of old lumber and debris. He parked near a metal shed. He told us to get out, as if we were boxes being delivered. That's when the future made a sound it had no right to make. I'll never forget the sound of duct tape being pulled from a roll in the darkness behind me. The noise braided itself with the dark, a practical music. He reached behind the seat and pulled a duffel. I saw the zippers and thought of mouths. I should tell you, I've rehearsed this moment 100 times, slowed it down like game film, until I can stare at each frame without blinking. He unzipped the bag, and what tumbled out was the worst kind of proof. Objects stripped of their owners. Inside were dozens of driver's licenses, cell phones, pieces of jewelry, wallets, a geography of loss. Some were scuffed into history. Some looked as if they still remembered pockets and purses. There was a wedding ring that seemed surprised to be apart from a finger, a lipstick the color of an argument, a key fob with a cracked logo. Dale saw us staring and explained matter-of-factly that he'd been helping stranded travelers on Highway 50 for almost a decade, and that business was good. He said it the way you'd talk about fishing, cycles of luck, the practical wisdom of patience. I understood something that made the air thinner. That's when I understood that our car breaking down wasn't some random mechanical failure. The day rewound, and showed me edits I had missed, where we stopped for photos, where I should have noticed a shadow that wasn't ours. Maybe he'd even done something to our car when we weren't looking during one of our photo stops. The idea didn't need proof. It had posture. The bag didn't contain souvenirs. It contained the parts of people you use to pretend they were never here. I measured the distance to the truck in units of miracle. Jamie's breathing had gone shallow and disciplined. The way she managed fear, the way photographers manage light. His posture said he'd done this enough times to call it routine. We weren't his first victims. We weren't even close. I thought of the licenses like a chorus, the names refusing to make a sound. Here is the decision I'm proud of and embarrassed by. I didn't think of heroics. I thought of inconvenience. Sand was everywhere, the kind of grit that inserts itself into memory. While Dale was distracted, showing us his collection and explaining his operation, I grabbed a handful of sand from the ground and threw it directly in his face. The motion was ugly, but fast. He stumbled, and his calm lost its costume. Truck, I said. A one-syllable prayer, and Jamie moved. We climbed in like trespassers and locked the doors so hard the mechanism felt judged. We managed to get both doors locked just as Dale recovered and started pounding on the windows. Rage looks so small when it's outside glass. The keys were in the ignition, as if arrogance had set the table. I have never loved an engine more. I started the engine and floored it back toward what I hoped was the main road. The truck lunged like a promise, keeping itself. The path was a thread. I didn't follow it as much as I convinced it not to break. In the mirror, he was a shape both distant and too close. Somehow, we made it back to Highway 50. The road widened like relief choosing us. We did not stop moving until the lights turned fluorescent and official. Fallon's sheriff's office had the decor of salvation. We drove straight to the sheriff's office in Fallon, where paperwork wears a badge and chairs mean you're allowed to sit down. We poured our fear onto forms. Deputies built a shape from it they could drive toward. They immediately sent units back to the mining camp. Government is a wonderful word when it arrives before regret. What they found later read like a ledger kept by a conscience with no punctuation. Evidence linking Dale to at least 15 different victims over the past 8 years. Shallow graves that didn't try hard enough to keep secrets. More belongings cataloged into grief. Records with the neatness of a man who had learned to tidy the parts of his life he let others see. Dale was arrested 6 hours later, trying to cross into California, still covered in the sand I'd thrown at him. The detail mattered to no one but me. It felt like a signature. People called us luck is a word that leaves out the math. Most of Dale's victims had been solo travelers, easy to misplace on calendars, harder to produce when someone finally asks. We went home and didn't sleep the way you normally don't sleep. We stayed awake the way a body refuses to power down when the cord has been frayed. We stayed together for a while because trauma builds a bridge you don't want to see collapse. Jamie and I broke up about 2 months after this happened. The story says it wasn't Dale. The truth says nothing else ever is. We couldn't stop thinking about that duffel bag and all those other people who hadn't been as fortunate as we were. Survivors is a word that implies you were present for a choice you made correctly. We were present for a mistake we escaped. After you hand your story to law enforcement, it becomes evidence. After evidence, it becomes a paragraph in a press release. After the press release, it becomes something that belongs to strangers. What's left is yours. The smell of old tape sticking to air. The taste of sand between your teeth. The certainty that every favor has a price you can't count yet. I learned to map my hometown by exits rather than streets. By which route had the fewest places a stranger could claim to know better than I did. I learned that I could wake up inside neutral smells. The inside of a rental car, the carpet of a waiting room, committing them to memory as safe. Safe became a work in progress. I've been back to Nevada. I promised myself I would go not to prove anything, but to look at the desert and give it back its vacancy. Highway 50 does not apologize. It never claimed it would. I pulled over at a scenic overlook because avoidance breeds consequences. I stepped out and let heat write its simple sentence across my forearms. The world did not tilt. The road did not open a trap door. I took a photograph with my phone, framed a long run of sagebrush and rock, and the emptiest sky I could find. I thought of her cannon. I thought of the weight of legacy you hang from your neck when you're trying to make meaning out of distance. I didn't press the shutter to commemorate anything. I pressed it to hear a quiet I could live with. When I got back in my car, a man in a pickup slowed to check on me. He wore kindness like a shirt that fit, the same way Dale had. He leaned out and asked if I was good. Maybe I said yes too fast. Maybe I wanted to show the universe I could be easy again. He nodded, blessed my day with the ordinary, and kept moving. People remain mostly exactly what they appear to be. The math, again. The part that makes statistics feel like witchcraft is we don't get to choose which one we meet on which day. I still keep a bag in the trunk, water, emergency triangles, a charger that holds its temper, a tool I pretend I could use. I keep a small tin of sand on my dashboard. It's ridiculous and unclean. It is also a key I give myself. I do not believe in talismans. I believe in reminders. The sand does not make me braver. It makes the part of me that can decide, remember, it has a job. I tell this story on purpose, to run a wire across the void for someone else, not to make you afraid of generosity, to make you practiced, to tell you that the same sun that sets behind you can be a compass if you let it. That duffel bag was a thesis about how much the world underestimates repetition. Evil is rarely creative. It's just diligent. Here is the last thing I'll keep. That is not mine. The silence was almost oppressive after hours of highway noise. It still is, sometimes, when the apartment hums and the refrigerator cuts off and the city catches its breath. In that silence, I stand in a metal shed I never want to see again. In that silence, I hear tape. In that silence, I pick up sand and close my hand and promise Jaime, wherever she is shooting now, that I will not walk into anything without first counting how many steps it would take me to walk back out. The sheriff's office gave us our copies and nothing more, but public records have a way of inviting themselves into your mailbox if you ask properly. I did not chase details to become a detective. I chased them because stories rot if you don't let air in. Report 18B. Mineral rights parcel. Coordinates redacted. photographs on matte paper. The images were ordinary until they decided not to be. A boot print angled wrong, as if the wearer had gotten out of a vehicle with impatience. A crushed cigarette filter a mile from anything to smoke at. A series of shallow ovals in resilient soil that suggested kneeling. The notes were precise and unromantic. They refused to tell me anything I couldn't stand up after hearing. Inventory list. Items recovered. Property room. B. The column labeled description did not care about me. It cared about a silver bracelet engraved L, a pocket knife with a marbled handle, a tourist map of Ely annotated with a violet pen. I ran my finger down the page until it stopped at a camera strap branded Canon. In handwriting, strap only. Procedures are kind until they aren't. I didn't reach out to families. I am not equipped to be a letter. But I read obituaries, the language we use to edit a life into something it would have liked to be true. One woman loved the open road. A man never met a stranger. Another died unexpectedly. A phrase that opens a blank you could fall through. I said their names out loud in my living room, and the room did not change. That is not how this works. Saying their names changed me, not the air. At therapy, I learned to inventory my own bag, the one I would unzip if I could make someone understand without showing them anything they didn't consent to seeing. Inside, a map of the desert with a coffee stain over Fallon. A gas receipt I kept like a pilgrim clutching a feather. A menu from the Reno diner where the waitress blessed all of us equally. A small stone from the shoulder of Highway 50 that I've told myself I will return one day when the story no longer needs proof. I asked Jamie if she wanted copies. We hadn't spoken in months, the way people don't when they promise to keep in touch but are really asking for parole. She wrote back the word no, and then a paragraph that meant not now. She told me she had started pointing her lens at people again, because it turns out faces are landscapes too. She wrote that she had stopped traveling alone, not out of fear, but to dilute solitude's influence. I read the message 3 times, not because it was complicated, but because kindness sometimes arrives understated, and you want to make sure you heard it. In the end, Dale pled to charges negotiated into shapes the law could carry. The district attorney sent a letter using language that had no room for poetry. Justice stands up straighter than closure. Closure is a lounge chair, and we hadn't earned one. The sentence was long because it had to be, and short because everything is. People asked if I wanted to watch the hearing online. I declined. I didn't want his voice to move through any system I depend on to fall asleep. I drove back to the mining camp once, with a deputy watching from a distance, because this is how we pretend to control variables. The buildings had not improved. The metal shed wore its dents like a memory that knew it didn't have to explain itself. I stood far enough away to keep my body from thinking it was back inside. I scattered the tin's sand into the wind and replaced it with Nevada's own. An exchange, a handshake. There is, in the story I tell about that afternoon, a version where I make myself smarter, faster, more strategic. A version where I catch the movement at the overlook. Note the wheel well scratch. Understand the angle of the sun sooner. That version is a lie by addition. The truth is, I was a man in love with a woman in love with light, and we were easy to find. If you're listening, Steal this from me. If someone shows up at the right time in the wrong place, count backwards. How many of your decisions brought them here? How many of theirs depend on you resisting the urge to be impolite? You can save your life with rudeness. You can save someone else's with a question that refuses to accept a smile as an answer. I do not hate strangers. I am one. Every time I enter a town I don't know, I am a person with a name that will not tell you whether I am safe. What I know now is that a trap is not a thing. It is a route. You avoid it, not by refusing help, but by designing your own way out while you are still being escorted in. The deputies took our statement and immediately sent units back to the mining camp. A line in a report. A door in the world. Somewhere out there, a woman holding a violet pen would not make it all the way to a sentence that said, died unexpectedly. Somewhere, a man who loved the open road would love it long enough to pass the habit to a nephew. The math is never precise, but I live here, on the side of the ledger that says I threw sand and a door opened. I have been asked if I forgive him. The word sticks because it belongs to other systems, faiths that require more certainty than I can afford. I have been asked if I would do anything differently. I would stop sooner. I would admit I didn't know the first thing about car repair sooner. I would offend earlier. I would accept help later. I would still take the scenic route. Beauty did not betray me. A man did. Story number 2. I used to believe pavement was honest. Measured miles. Predictable exits. A map that obeyed the wristwatch. I don't believe that anymore. Because some roads don't take you someplace. They take you somewhen. And if you miss the turn that isn't on any sign, you learn what it costs to be late to a moment that won't die. My name is Rain, and the longest night of my life lasted half an hour, again and again, until it learned my name. Some roads in America don't follow the laws of physics. They follow something much darker and more ancient. I didn't write that in a journal. I set it to my dashboard, the first time I realized my clock had surrendered. I discovered this on a back highway in Montana, where time itself became my prison. Those words are mine, and also not mine. I spoke them while trying to stay awake, while trying to stay sane, while counting the breath between mile markers that refused to change. It was October. The air clean enough to taste metal at the back of the tongue. Mountains sharpened by cold. The sky so clear it seemed to ring if you stared too hard. I had a trailer full of high-end electronics that did not believe in ghosts. Neither did I. The job divorces you from superstition because superstition slows you down. But speed doesn't matter when the mile you're in is married to its reflection. My name is Rain, and I'm a long-haul trucker who's been driving cross-country routes for 12 years. 12 years is enough time to collect a country's worth of anxieties. Elk at dawn. Ice you can't see. Radios that warn too late. What it didn't prepare me for was recognition. Recognizing the same crooked neon, the same tilted trash can, the same torn paper, snagged in the same sage like a flag at half-mast. The first time the station appeared, I logged it as a kindness. Rural fuel, 2 pumps, canted roof, a sign that had lost most of its bulbs, but not its nerve. Last chance, gas. it declared, as if the prairie would hold a grudge if I drove past. I didn't stop. I made a mental note of it, because my fuel gauge was showing about 3/4 full. Out here, you track numbers the way sailors watch stars. Half an hour later, it stood there again. Same bruise of light, same leaning ice chest, same windless flag. I told myself I'd doubled back without noticing. Fatigue arranges small betrayals like that. It collects them in a place you don't check. So I checked. Odometer, trip meter, engine hours. The math frowned back at me. According to my trip meter, I'd only driven about 12 miles since leaving Kalispell, a number that made me say my own name just to hear it. I pulled in. The gravel did not remember other tires. The glass was dusty. The aisles inside edited by decades of silence. Prices out of a childhood I hadn't lived. Newspapers dated from 1987. A calendar that refused to flip. I lifted my phone for proof and captured static like a man netting darkness. Back in the cab, the CB had learned a new accent. Radio shows from decades ago, old music, vintage commercials, a world you could almost smell, hot dust in vacuum tubes, coffee that had been boiling since sunrise. The GPS showed empty wilderness, a map that had decided my road wasn't there anymore, as if cartographers were more superstitious than they let on. Here is where fear changes its clothes. At first, it walks like confusion, harmless, apologetic. Then it sits down in the passenger seat and buckles up. Then it takes the wheel. Every experiment failed. Speed was irrelevant. Braking changed nothing. U-turns delivered me to the same pumps. The exact same gas station. An accusation in corrugated steel. I parked and walked the loop, like a dog learning the boundaries of an invisible fence. The fence didn't move. I did. Sometime that should have been midnight, but midnight was on strike. I saw the truck. 80s body. Square as a jaw. Paint bleached the color of old denim. The man inside glanced through me, like I was a photograph he didn't remember posing for. 15 minutes later, he was in front of me, running east now, chasing something urgent in a future that had already happened. That's when I understood. Geography wasn't the only thing with a seam. I wasn't just trapped in a geographical loop. I was somehow caught in a temporal distortion. The light had a different temperature. The road's texture belonged to a different department of transportation. Even the stars rearranged themselves into constellations that looked almost right, and therefore worse. When desperation runs out of road, it goes to work with its hands. I tried breaking what could be broken. I tried refusing to drive. A sit-in against the machinery of a minute. The machinery didn't negotiate. After exactly 30 minutes, I'd find myself back in my truck, approaching the same location again. I carved my initials behind the station among a forest of other initials. Proof of a community that would never meet. Help me. Can't get out. I did not write those. Someone with my handwriting did. When the gauge finally admitted the truth, empty instead of 3/4 full, a new fear climbed into the cab, quiet and confident. Out here, running out of fuel is a sermon with one point. I parked by the pumps that had become a shrine to themselves and did the thing that drivers hate most. I started walking. The road at night is a museum of distances. Each reflector is a small priest blessing you forward. My flashlight didn't reach far. Darkness rationed itself. The way a town rations water after a dry winter. A mile, maybe a mile and a half. And the thing I had missed from a seat 6 feet above the ground finally raised its hand. A weathered historical marker with the humility of stone. Dates don't shout. They just stand there until you do the math. October 15th, 1987. A family of 4 had died in a collision during a sudden snowstorm. The plaque kept its voice low. At exactly 11:30 p.m. It didn't accuse the road or the weather. It didn't accuse anyone. It simply told me what time was doing here, and what it had been doing without rest for 38 years. Guarding the perimeter of a last minute. I read it twice. I said 11:30 aloud, the way you test a lock after it clicks. I do not know if recognition changes a place, or only the person inside it. I know that when I turned back, the sky seemed to breathe for the first time in hours. I know the mountains were the same height, but stood differently, as if someone had asked them to be patient, and they had agreed. In the cab, the starter sounded like work, and not like ritual. The road wasn't kind, exactly. It was available. 10 minutes, and a new station showed up. A modern one with LED lighting. The kind of brightness that has never met memory. My phone woke and asked what it had missed. The GPS redrew the world with the confidence of a liar who has been promoted to historian. I didn't stop. I drove straight through, letting the miles accrue like a defense. The logbook missed almost 6 hours. A theft I signed for anyway. When dispatch asked what happened, I handed them a vocabulary they could file. Navigation error and equipment malfunction. I was careful with my tone. The truth needs witnesses, and all mine were trapped in a half hour. None of us can leave. Now here is the part of the story where people ask for proof. They want dates and tickets and timestamps. And I understand why. It matters to build a case against what scares us. But proof is a city animal. Out here, truth runs feral. It leaves prints that disappear when the wind gets up. I drove the route in daylight later. Not because I thought daylight was stronger, but because I wanted to see what the night had edited. Nothing extraordinary. No scar in the asphalt. No hanged tree the color of a warning. But when I passed the marker at a legal speed, I didn't breathe until my mirrors released it. You think a story like this earns you companionship. It doesn't. It buys you a weird silence in diners and a different kind of nod from the ones who drive when the world is asleep. It buys you forums where men and women argue about whether the human brain can reboot without warning, whether highways are just long rooms where the mind learns its own echo. It buys you, sometimes, a message at 2 a.m. I saw the same car you did, different road, different year, and it buys you this, a habit of listening to the night for the sound of your own route folding back on itself. I don't believe in curses. I believe in maintenance. So I check the straps twice and the tires with my thumb, and I keep the radio low enough to hear the dark argue with itself. I keep my eyes open for anything that remembers me. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through remote areas, I worry that I might find myself back there again, watching the needle lean toward a confession, with nowhere to go but around and around until time itself forgets I ever existed. If it happens, I will know the minute by the taste of the air and the way the stars blink like an old film. If it happens, I will stop again at the sign with the small voice and the big job. I will tell the family what I should have told them the first time. I see you. Maybe that's all any of us can do for the dead minute. Witness it without letting it draft our names into its payroll. Maybe that's how roads forgive, if they ever do. Not by unfolding, but by remembering out loud. And if you ever notice a gas station coming up on your right, all wrong for its century and too perfect in its dust, think of me. Last chance, gas. That is not an advertisement. That is a diagnosis. Fill up on attention. Fill up on the names of your dead and the living who are late to dinner, and the hills that will still be here when the concrete is gone. Drive through if you can. Walk if you must. If you can't, carve your initials where ours are. Not for rescue, but so the next poor cousin of mine will know we kept each other company. I wish I could tell you I learned a lesson that fixed more than it broke. I didn't. I learned only that some miles, every mile I drove, only took me further from escape. Are not miles. They are a room with one door, and the lock is a date, and the key is remembering that time. Like any engine, can and will flood. You ask what changed when the loop let go. The truth is unromantic. I slept, I ate, I delivered. But afterward, small repairs took longer. I lingered beside my truck, like a man who has lost a word and is waiting for it to return on its own. I drove the plains, with the window cracked, letting October count my pulse. I wrote a list of what I knew, the way you do after a close call. The loop was 30 minutes long. It respected no speed I could reach. It reset at 11:30 p.m. The air was thinner there, not in oxygen, but in possibilities. The station existed and did not. The names cut into wood were not signatures. They were prayers. There were messages. To help me. Can't get out. Time is broken here. The line read like a stare I refused to step off. If you ask whether I believe time is broken in that place, I will say this. It works exactly as designed for them. For the family whose minute got promoted to manager. For the man in the blue truck who can't make his turn because it already happened. For the version of me who is still walking east beneath a field of stars that do not move. I thought about going back with flowers. It felt indecent. What do you bring to a minute that will never end? I settled for attention. The next time I took Highway 2, I did it with the engine arguing gently beneath me, and the sun pinning the shadow of my rig like a specimen. Nothing happened, which is its own mercy and its own kind of grief. This will sound strange, but sometimes I wonder if we all live inside long minutes that look like years from the outside. If the job you don't leave becomes your loop. If the apology you never make rebuilds the room while you sleep. If the town you swear you'll abandon teaches the horizon to wait until you forget its name. Maybe we're all carving initials into the posts of our own small stations, hoping someone reads them and decides to keep driving. I've done some research. Like any person who has made friends with a problem he cannot fix, you find out quick that any subject, however haunted, breeds hobbyists. Men who collect lost time like stamps. Women who map dead telephones. There are stories of temporal loops missing time, and encounters with vehicles and people from different decades. Most of them are noise with a good haircut. A few are pieces of a shape I have seen. I do not propose a theory. Theories are trains. They flatten the landscape to make the timetable respectable. I prefer a story that lets the contour live. Here is mine. The road holds an archive the way a body holds scars. Some get read back into the world when the conditions rhyme: temperature, pressure, grief. Sometimes a driver is unlucky enough, or tender enough, to be drafted as a reader. And if the road is an archive, who is the librarian? That is where I stop. I don't want a name for whatever kept balancing the ledger to exactly 30 minutes. It was efficient. It was patient. It was not cruel. Or if it was, it had a reason that did not require me to understand it. On good nights, I think the loop let me go because I listened. On bad nights, I think it let me go because it was done with me. Either way, I still check the mirrors, even when they only show the ordinary grace of asphalt and sky. I still count the seconds at railroad crossings, a private exorcism. I still talk to the families on old markers when I pass them, not out loud, not in words, just a nod from a moving confessional. If you are reading this on a long night with too much road in front of you and not enough song on the radio, if your gauge is honest and your lights are true and your hands feel like they belong to someone steadier, listen. You do not have to be a librarian tonight. If the world asks for your card, say no. If the station with the unlit bulbs appears, it is a museum, not a rescue. Walk, if you must, but only to read the stone, not to live in it. I will end where I began, because that is what the road taught me. Some roads in America don't follow the laws of physics. They follow something much darker and more ancient. If you meet one, be kinder than I was. Tell it what time it is. Tell it who you carry. Tell it you have stops to make in towns that don't remember you yet. And if you must, leave your initials where the wood is soft, so that when I come through, I know which way the living went. Story number 3. I used to think danger announced itself with shattered glass or a busted lock, something obvious enough to jolt you into action. I didn't understand that the most efficient kind of harm prefers silence, notebooks, and long observation at the edge of your life. I used to check the rear view for traffic. Now, I check for eyes, for the suggestion of breath where no one should be, for the indentation in upholstery that means weight, for a familiarity that doesn't belong to us. I used to measure road trips in miles and playlists. After that summer, I measured them in blind spots, the places I couldn't see, the places I assumed were mine and safe. I used to love arriving late to hotel rooms, the gentle shuffle of keys and cards, my kids tumbling onto beds, the soft ritual of drawing curtains. After that summer, every curtain felt like a door someone else had already walked through. I used to think preparation meant full tanks, fresh oil, and a cooler packed with fruit. Now I know preparation means mapping how someone might take what you love, and refusing to leave any part of your life unguarded. My name is Trevor, and I promise I didn't become a fearful man by choice. Fear arrived like a passenger I never invited. Quiet at first, almost polite, teaching me how to reread the ordinary until every detail developed a second meaning. I can trace the inflection point to a family trip that should have been the kind you put in a frame. 2 weeks, open highway, the long sandstone horizon where the United States seems to lean back and breathe. My wife, Sarah, planned attractions with the precision of a cartographer. Our kids, Boston at 10, dead serious about photographing clouds, and Philip at 8, ruling the back seat with trivia questions, counted down for weeks. I had my truck serviced, wiped the cargo liner until it looked new, and told myself the sound I heard when I closed the hatch was the sound of competence. The first day felt like a brochure. Sun on the windshield, the kind that glows rather than blinds. Traffic spaced out like courteous punctuation. The car smelled faintly of citrus wipes and the chalky sweetness of kids' vitamins. The navigation voice murmured, and Sarah cross-checked every route like a co-pilot. I drove and allowed myself to believe we were stepping into a preserved moment. One of those uncomplicated scenes families use to explain who they are. A few hours into Texas, my son asked a question that wasn't trivia. "Dad, what's that noise?" His tone was casual, the way a kid tries not to ruin a game, but it threaded my spine. I listened. The car is its own orchestra when you pay attention. Tire hiss, engine hum, the whisper of air. This was different, something restrained, as if it understood the etiquette of not drawing attention. Sarah twisted in her seat and frowned, then handed back a bottle of water, as if hydration could fix uncertainty. I told myself it was luggage shifting. We had chairs and bags, and the stiff, forgiving geometry of coolers. We had enough gear to build a temporary household anywhere we stopped. We pulled into a rest area where the trees stood far apart, like people waiting for a bus. I opened the hatch and breathed in the refrigerated scent of plastic coolers and detergent. Everything sat in the precise Tetris I had built that morning. Duffels faced forward like obedient dogs. The cooler clips were unbothered. The camp chairs nested at harmless angles. I pressed on each strap, tested each nut, obeyed the ritual of dads who want to be right about weight distribution. Nothing was out of place, which is a sentence that now reads to me like foreshadowing. Back on the road, Boston said she saw movement in the mirror, then shook her head and laughed it off. The car filled with the small comforts of travel, guessing games, roadside billboards threatening eternal consequences for unsafe speeds. My daughter narrating the shape of clouds like a weather anchor. I settled into the drive again, but the question my son had asked stayed with me in the way an itch stays after you stop scratching. By late afternoon, a smell crept forward, damp, stale, the scent of a basement that holds someone else's memory. The kids scrunched their faces. Sarah lifted her chin and sniffed the air, like she could break the odor into components and name each one. Windows went down. Windows went up. Air cycled. The smell persisted, the way a thought persists when you try not to have it. We stopped for dinner at one of those places where the lighting is warm enough to forgive, where servers call you and mean it. The four of us ordered exactly what our moods advertised. Sarah's salad, Boston's pancakes from the kids' menu, because breakfast for dinner is a statement of optimism. Philip's chicken tenders, arranged like trophies. My burger that pretended to be accountability because it came with lettuce. My family talked about constellations and roadside attractions, and I nodded. Then I excused myself and stepped outside to the parking lot because curiosity can be a form of love when it keeps your people safe. The lot was quiet. A soft orange wash from lamps that made every car look gentler. I unlocked the hatch again and committed to going beyond the polite inspection. I unstacked the chairs. I slid the coolers. I angled the suitcases out like teeth. Behind a suitcase, in a pocket of darkness that existed only because I'd created it with my careful packing, I found a small constellation of trash, a plastic bottle, a few wrappers that didn't belong to our snacks. Not old, not dusty, new enough to feel like a timeline I hadn't signed off on. It was such a minor discovery that my body's reaction embarrassed me. Cold, then hot, then suddenly aware of how much space a cargo bay represents. Space for utility, space for secrets. I called Sarah out and showed her, without naming the fear. Our kids stayed inside, laughing toward the window glass. She is practical. She is good at not letting me get ahead of the facts. She put a hand on my arm and said what calm people say. Let's not make a scene. We loaded everything back with movements that suggested normal travel. And I told myself there were reasonable explanations. Maybe a tech at the car wash had tossed trash by accident. Maybe a wrapper had been pressed flat by weight, and only now exhaled into view. At the hotel, the kids claimed beds with the authority of explorers. We turned on the kind of television that gives you small stories without demanding much back. I waited until they were asleep, then took a flashlight and returned to the lot. My reflection in the rear glass looked like a man learning to doubt himself. I opened the hatch and did the opposite of organization. I disassembled. I created the chaos I had been avoiding. Because sometimes you have to tear the room apart to prove the house is empty. Near the back, in a trough where the wheel well curves and the carpet gathers lint, I found evidence of intention. Towels padded into a pillow, a sweater folded in a way that suggested someone respected their own comfort, a pocket notebook with writing whose pressure had bitten through pages. I didn't read much. I read enough. Notes about schedules, notes about routes, notes about where we kept a spare key in our previous house, observations about my children, couched as data. The tone was patient. The tone had time. I would like to tell you. I called the police then. I would like to say I sealed the car and brought my family into a safe container of procedures. Instead, I held the notebook and felt my breath shorten. I thought about the people in the neighboring rooms who would not understand a stranger crawling out of a cargo space that belonged to a family they could overhear through two thin walls. I thought about my kids' faces if I told them the world was smaller than we had promised. I woke my wife, showed her what I had found, and only then called. Response time can feel like a medical statistic when your heart won't accept it. 10 minutes extended like a corridor. The officers arrived and did what their training demands. Gloves, evidence bags, questions with neutral tones. They didn't tell me I was overreacting. They didn't tell me this was common. They told me a version of the truth we were going to learn in stages. That patience, when applied to harm, can be the most dangerous trait a person possesses. The next morning, a detective with careful eyes sat us down. He spoke in the language of patterns, making a map out of our week and the weeks before it. The notebook, he said, read like a project plan. The camera they pulled from the interior trim read like a diary with images. Overnight, they had matched a name to a method. The man was older than I expected, younger than would have made me feel less responsible. He had previous charges, previous families, previous pages of notes that could have been ours, if not for the pronouns. They canvassed the hotel and the surrounding lots. That phrase, canvassed the hotel, sounds like a tarp you can pull over a problem and tie down. In practice, it meant hours of reviewing footage, talking to staff, checking rooms that had been paid in cash. I answered questions with my hands clasped until the skin went white. We said our kids' names more times than felt safe. My wife repeated details with the steadiness of someone who understands that clarity is a form of defense. The arrest happened a few towns away. When they told us, I didn't cheer. Relief can't erase what you've learned. It just reschedules it. The man had been staying in motels that don't check much beyond whether your card runs. In his room, they found notebooks written with the same iron handwriting as the one in our cargo area, pages that divided families into qualities and leverage points. Some entries read like timelines converging, as if he believed in maturity dates for crimes. Ours had been approaching. The detective explained a pattern I wish did not exist. Long observation, patient rehearsal, small invasions to test for alarms, both literal and emotional. If nothing happened, a larger step. If a camera remained undetected, another. If a hidden place in a vehicle remained undisturbed after a night, move in supplies. He said this in a voice free of theatrics. He told us that the man preferred families structurally similar to ours. He told us that he often chose travel as escalation because people relax their vigilance where there is movement. Back home, the story did not end. There are closures that satisfy paperwork, and closures that satisfy the body. These rarely sync. We installed cameras and changed locks and moved. Moving is an action we pretend solves things. It only relocates them. Still, the logistics were something to hold. I rewired lights. I taught myself to trace every chord and line as if I were learning a song. I inspected the underside of our car with a mirror and a checklist I made myself because lists felt like armor. Sarah developed habits that looked like rituals. The kids learned to announce the presence of anyone outside before opening doors. We had family meetings about boundaries that sounded like we were running a small company. The kids asked when things would feel normal. We told them the truth. Normal isn't a place you return to. It's a custom you build again. Therapy gave the kids language for things we had been calling shadows. Boston, who once narrated clouds, started describing feelings with meteorological precision. Philip, who could turn anything into a guessing game, learned that you shouldn't have to guess whether you are safe. At night, when the house exhaled like houses do, I would lie awake and imagine a classroom where predators teach each other patience. I would imagine someone with a notebook explaining that the most efficient way to enter a life is to become the part of it that is ignored. The court case moved with the measured steps of an institution that cannot afford to run. Dates were set and moved. Statements were prepared. We showed up when asked, dressed like solid citizens, in the hope that signaling order would invite it closer. The sentence, when it arrived, felt both heavy and insufficient. Years can be counted. Years cannot refund. People asked us if we felt vindicated. We felt documented. I still drive. I still take my family places. I check my mirrors more. But not with panic, with training. I think about the difference between living defensively and living fearfully. And I choose the former the way you choose seatbelts. We talk in the car the way we always did. But now I tell my kids the secret I didn't know to tell myself. That safety is not only about locks and cameras. It is about refusing to be predictable in the ways that make you easy to study. It is about changing your departure time by 10 minutes. It is about varying routes. It is about making sure that the shadows you carry are only yours. If you are reading this because you sense something is off, the extra wrapper, the misaligned strap, the smell that doesn't match your family, understand this. You are not paranoid. You are observant. The difference is whether you act. Ask the question out loud in a parking lot. Open the hatch, even if someone rolls their eyes. Disassemble comfort to find what it has been hiding. And if you discover you were wrong, applaud yourself in private. If you discover you were right, you will have given your future a chance to arrive as planned. I replay the trip sometimes with a stubborn imagination. I reroute us to different exits. I invent a version in which I find nothing. A version in which that notebook belongs to no one. And the towels are only towels. Then I stop. Because the story is not a daydream. It's a ledger. It taught me that the scariest passenger is not the one you catch. It's the one who believes your life is an open book and decides to annotate it. It's the patient mind that studies you until it can perform you better than you can. The only ending I can accept is the one where we keep writing our own margins. And so, I keep a final ritual. Before every drive, I run my hand along the cargo carpet, press each anchor point, lift the panels where the tools sit, and give the empty space a name. Ours. I let the kids see me do it, not to scare them, but to induct them into a more accurate world. One where good people don't wait for alarms to tell them they're allowed to act. One where being careful is not a symptom of fear. It's a way of staying free. One where the rearview mirror doesn't offer dread so much as proof that what's behind you is exactly what you think it is. Your own reflection, your own steady face, and the road you've already survived. Story number 4. The first time I heard my own voice pleading for an ambulance. The top was down, the ocean was bright as a blade, and the radio swore I was dying. The second time, it spoke in Crew's exact cadence, his lazy vowels, his steady calm, reporting that I had a head wound and he wasn't breathing. By the third time, road signs felt like omens and mile markers like countdown timers. I kept telling myself that radios don't haunt people. They play songs and ball games and ads for dental implants. But that stretch of Highway 1 has its own programming. A channel tuned to the last thing you wish you'd said. I'm Camden, and the year I turned 26, I promised a quiet celebration for my best friend. Crew wanted sky and salt and the long ribbon of the Pacific Coast Highway, rather than a weekend of neon and noise. So we booked a few unassuming motels, circled scenic pullouts on a map, and rented the kind of car that makes strangers turn their heads. The sun had the generosity of early April, and wind moved through the Mustang like a tame animal. The plan was to drive from Los Angeles to San Francisco over 4 days, staying at small coastal towns and taking our time to enjoy the scenery along Highway 1. I agreed, because a plan that patient felt like luck. We threaded Malibu, indulged the ritual of stopping to take photos with the blinding horizon, let playlists from high school stir up old, harmless ghosts, locker rooms, first apartments, summer jobs that smelled like fryer oil. Crew talked about vows and a backyard reception, and the way he said Emma's name made it sound like a place rather than a person. A destination with light in the windows. The road north of Carpinteria began to slither. Cliff on one side, water on the other. The white line, a tightrope we had to cross without looking down. We kept our speed shy of reckless, respectful of sudden curves and the way shadow pooled in the hollows of the hills. I was ready for the usual coastal weirdness. Fog like a moving wall, sand whisked across asphalt, maybe a sudden deer. I wasn't ready for the radio to develop a conscience. It started as fatigue in the signal. The station dissolved into static, returned in ragged pieces, loose threads of guitar. Crew thumbed the dial without looking. The speaker cleared its throat, and then a voice we didn't recognize filled the car with the kind of calm that belongs in an emergency. Mayday, Mayday. This is the red Mustang convertible, southbound on Highway 1 near Carperia. We've gone off the road and we're trapped in the vehicle. 2 occupants, both conscious but injured. Please send emergency assistance immediately. We looked at each other in that confused, stage-lit way. I thought you were doing that. No, I thought you were doing that. Our Mustang was red. Our direction was southbound only a few minutes earlier, when we looped to find a viewpoint. The location was close enough to feel pointed. Crew spun through stations as if he could outrun what we'd heard. The same frequency, a different voice. A woman sobbing her location near Pismo Beach. A rollover, kids in the back. Another click, and a motorcyclist listing his injuries in the clenched, almost polite diction of pain. None of it sounded like a scanner. There was no dispatcher, no codes, just raw calls, as if the car had become a confession booth. What rattled me wasn't only the detail, mile markers, named beaches, the way drivers described the angle of a slope or a blind curve, like people who had stared at them for too long. It was the timing. We would listen, white-knuckled, and then, 20 minutes later, pass the exact spot, the exact stand of cypress, the exact fold of cliff, and there would be nothing. No debris, no flares, no gathering of strangers tugging at seatbelts. The road wore a clean face. The road curves back and forth between steep cliffs and the ocean, with very little shoulder and no guardrails in some sections. We drove as if the asphalt might abruptly remember gravity. The radio continued. A minivan whispering into Bois near Big Sur. A pickup spinning toward a tree line. A voice that broke on the word, please. We tried explanations, because explanations are a kind of control. Crew suggested we were catching training drills. I offered atmospheric skip. Recordings rebroadcast by accident, or some prankster's morbid channel stitched together from news clips. None of those theories could mimic the way the voices referenced what we hadn't yet seen. Sunlight tilted toward evening between Morro Bay and Cambria. That hour when the ocean looks like it's hiding something under the surface. I was telling Crew we should stop soon. when the radio said my name without saying it. The cadence was mine, the breath between words, the frown buried in my consonants, the habit of softening the ends of sentences. This is Highway 1, northbound near Surf Beach. Red Mustang convertible has gone over the embankment. Driver is unconscious. Passenger appears to have serious head injuries. We need paramedics and rescue equipment immediately. The car is about 50 feet down the cliff face. Crew eased us to a scenic turnout and killed the engine like you extinguish a candle for fear of fire catching elsewhere. The only sounds were waves chewing rock and a gull's distant complaint. We stared at the dash as if it had bitten us. My mouth worked around the dry idea of humor. Good one. Very funny. You got me. But the words refused their lines. It was definitely his voice. Exactly his voice, with his speech patterns, and even his way of pronouncing certain words. I could have argued against myself forever and not believed a syllable. We sat there until the sky was the color of old photographs. To drive on felt like daring fate to read its lines to us again. To turn back felt like flinching. The coast does that, makes you think there is only forward and down. We chose forward because humans always do. We ate in Cambria because hunger is proof you still belong to the living. The hostess seated us near a window where the glass reflected our faces faintly over plates of halibut and fries, like a double exposure of then and now. Crew scrolled through highway memorial pages and accident maps with his thumb, jaw tightening incrementally each time a date aligned with a landmark we had heard. I cross-checked news briefs. A red convertible off Carpinteria in 2019. 2 students. A night too dark to see the flashing lights until they were too close. A motorcyclist down near Hearst Castle 6 months ago. Not fatal on impact, but gone before sunrise. A family van in fog. The driver disoriented by absence of edge lines. The coincidences stacked until they resembled structure. Using accident databases and news reports, we found that every spot mentioned in the radio transmissions had been the site of fatal accidents within the past few years. I wanted that sentence to stay theoretical. The radio did not. Back in the motel, the room radio took up the story the car had started. It bled through at low volume. Locations north of us, descriptions precise as coordinates. Voices that didn't sound like people who expected to be believed, but like people who expected help. I turned the knob exactly to its detent, and the sound sharpened, as if the dial had slipped across a seam in the world. The calls multiplied toward midnight. I kept a notepad because tallying is a way to avoid trembling. San Simeon, Ragged Point, Gorda. Types of vehicles, alleged causes, minor details that didn't feel minor. The song that had been playing, the color of a hoodie, a broken thermos, leaking coffee that smelled like burnt sugar. There is an intimacy to specificity. It makes every disaster someone's. It was like listening to a continuous stream of people dying in car accidents along the exact route we were planning to take. Between lines, between calls, I heard surf and the motel's ice machine and the solemn breath of the heater. You could call it a duet. Ordinary life patiently underscoring catastrophe. We slept a little, badly. Morning brought proof, as if the day had been reading our notes. 3 accidents during the night on the highway ahead, faithfully matching the litany we'd heard. The anchor on the local station said the word fatal, with a cadence that tried to be respectful and failed. Language doesn't know where to put its hands when someone is gone. Crew suggested we turn around. I could see the relief that would offer him, the way retreat sometimes feels like release rather than surrender. I said, "Let's go slow. Let's understand." I didn't realize that understanding is a blade you can't safely hold. We kept our speed domesticated. Blinkers on early, headlights at noon, and both hands doing the kind of work that looks effortless from a distance. The radio did not wait. It whispered about the hours to come, as if narrating a future that had already happened once and was eager to try again. Around sunset, we heard another transmission in my voice. The memory of that sentence lived in the speaker, but the content changed. A deer, Moonstone Beach, a collision with a tree, the smell of radiator steam, the world obliged like a stage set, rearranging between scenes. Near Big Sur, the kind of curve that banks trustingly toward emptiness delivered the precise tableau we'd heard an hour earlier. Emergency lights ricocheting off the cliff wall, a red sports car nesting where rock gives up and scrub begins. Responders asking for the right tools, like gardeners requesting a gentler spade. We drove by at the speed of second thoughts. The radio narrated the scene we were passing as if to prove that it could. That's when we understood that the radio wasn't just picking up emergency calls from past accidents. It was communicating with the present's soft belly and the future's stubborn outline. It was choosing us as its audience, or maybe we were simply moving through the only place it could be heard. A rational brain wants a mechanism. We brainstormed until the words lost their hinges. Tropospheric ducting, ghost frequencies, bleeding transmitters. That kind of talk is a sedative. It doesn't heal, but it dulls. We crested a rise where the ocean grew large and strange, a sheet of hammered metal, light striking and recoiling. Crew's knuckles had gone expressionless. He said my name and I said yes, and neither of us had anything left to add. San Francisco should have felt like a rival. The city a collection of spires and bridges and relief. Instead, it felt like an echo. We parked, and the car ticked as metal cooled, the way bodies do when adrenaline abandons them. The radio went still, as if it respected municipal boundaries. We collected our breaths in a coffee shop with steamed windows and regulars reading tabloids. The barista handed me a mug with a chipped rim, and the chip made me think of crumpled fenders. We did not talk about calling Emma. Crew's wedding existed in a parallel world where the worst thing that happens is a wrong-sized suit. In our world, we had been told how we might die and where, and even the cliff height had been measured for us in feet. The car is about 50 feet down the cliff face. That number kept returning, uninvited, like a cough. Here is what grief looks like when the person is still alive. Postponements, unmailed invitations, tuxedo fittings put on hold, a polite email to a venue about deposit policies. Crew postponed his wedding for several months because he was too traumatized to focus on celebration. We wrote versions of those sentences and sent them softly, as if sound might bruise. As for me, the highway grew teeth. I pictured failures of traction in places where tires were obedient. I imagined my skull striking something important inside it. I developed severe anxiety about driving on highways, especially in areas with poor cell service, where emergency help might not be readily available. The sentence felt like a diagnosis and an apology, and neither back home. I did not abandon radios. I collected them like charms. AM, FM, ham. Even a kit that promised shortwave listening from the kitchen table. Late at night, I tuned bands the way people trace scars, fingertips reacquainting themselves with old edges. Sometimes there was nothing. Sometimes I found a preacher who believed the end of days had good marketing. Sometimes I found them again, the people who sounded like they were standing in the exact geometry of disaster. I've heard them on other highways in different states. The grammar of those calls remains consistent. The location arrives first, tight as a pin, then the nature of the injury, often with an odd detail attached. A dog in the passenger footwell, a seatbelt that refuses to release, an airbag that tastes like damp coins. The voices are steady, more often than not, which I didn't expect. Panic takes energy, perhaps the body, when it knows the end is near, saves energy for breathing instead. I started a log. Columns for date, time, band, frequency, road, mile marker, vehicle type, weather. Cross-referencing the notes with public reports broke something and rebuilt something else. The timeline almost always held. The outliers were worse because they were gifts, warnings that described incidents which, when I checked a week later, had indeed transpired. I don't ask anyone to accept that last sentence. I no longer ask myself not to. The dead are trying to warn us about the dangers we can't see coming. It is not a belief I wear in public. It is a fact that fits under a shirt like a bruise. When sleep came, it brought Surf Beach with it. The same overlook, the same low fence, the slope beyond like a pulled-back sheet. I dreamed of climbing down and finding our car, waiting like a time capsule. Sand collecting in seams, gulls indifferent and precise. The dream never let me open the door. I would always wake right before I reached for the handle. According to the radio transmissions, we died in that accident. Our bodies were never found, and we're still calling for rescue from the bottom of a cliff where no one will ever hear us. I do not claim that sentence is true. I only admit that it has the weight of truth, the kind that makes your knees stiff when you stand. If there's a doctrine to this haunting, it's caution. I drive like I'm carrying fragile glass in every direction. I leave early enough that time never has to scold me. I treat the first drop of rain as a memo from physics. This is the religion of people who have read the Sermon of Asphalt, but there is also curiosity. It's a human flaw we share with cats and, apparently, radios. So I returned to Surf Beach in late summer, alone. A day when tourists had taken their cameras to other viewpoints. The wind worked through the grass like someone stroking animal fur. I parked in the same turnout where we had killed the engine and listened to the world breathe. The radio was a simple handheld in my lap, a plastic rectangle with an antenna that felt both meek and arrogant. I dialed slowly, like a safecracker, pausing when I hit the taut, humming feeling that says you're near something decisive. Music fluttered in short, wounded bursts, an announcer's voice flattened by distance, and then the same band where almost everything important happens for me. not quite centered on the dial, a hair into its own shadow. The words arrived already familiar, though I'd never recorded these exact ones before. Sometimes, late at night, I still tune through radio frequencies and listen for those distress calls. The irony was not lost on me. The station was quoting my life back at me. The voice that said it was mine. The message that followed was the worst version yet. I heard crew, soft, steady, utterly certain, saying my name the way people do when they need you to wake up. He gave a location that made my stomach pitch. He requested specific equipment, as if familiarity had made him fluent in rescue. He described a passenger, me, with a head wound and shallow breaths. He talked about sand giving way underfoot, the danger to the first people down the slope, the need for belay lines, I said aloud. To no one. I'm right here. I said it 3 times because repetition sometimes persuades the air to rearrange itself. The radio was gentle and pitiless. Sometimes I wonder if we actually did die on that trip. The sentence laid itself over the landscape like fog. I could have left then. I forced myself not to. I sat with it until the sun remembered evening is a thing, until the sky became long metal shavings of orange, and the headlands cast careful shadows. I wrote the time. I wrote the weather. I wrote that there were no other cars in the turnout, and no footprints fresh enough to matter. I wrote that a girl carried off a sandwich wrapper, and that a family of 3 debated whether the wind made it too cold to stay. And then, because I am still alive in every ordinary way a person can be, I started the car, turned the radio to something that had the dignity to be trivial, and drove away without looking into the rearview mirror. Some superstitions are good policy back home. I logged the day. I listened again to the voice memos I had made on my phone, gently raising the volume where the wind had tried to erase a syllable. The playback made me 2 people at once, the listener who wants evidence and the subject who deserves sleep. There is a mercy buried inside this horror. It is practical and unromantic. The calls have taught me to anticipate the places where a human body becomes overly confident. Every blind crest, every merge that assumes other drivers are mind readers, every sun-bleached sign warning of falling rock, as if the rock is waiting for your particular car. When the radio speaks now, I listen not for prophecy, but for instruction. I do not know if the dead are talking, or if we have invented a way to hear our fear in a pitch we finally respect. I only know the station exists, and on some nights it knows my name, and that is enough to keep me from pretending the world is safe simply because it has been generous so far. Before sleep, I sometimes place the handheld on the nightstand like a glass of water. I turn the volume down to a thread. I wait, and through walls and darkness and the ordinary sounds of old plumbing, I hear the smallest voice rise, familiar as a hand on my shoulder, light as static. We're still calling for rescue. I do not hang up. Story number 5. I thought the road would rinse me clean. I thought 5 calm mornings between the desert and the Atlantic would make me brave. I thought strangers were just other lives passing by, not a program written with my name in it. I thought good planning beat bad luck. I was wrong in ways I am still paying for. The first time I noticed the pattern, I told myself it was nothing. The most terrifying realization isn't that you're being followed. It's discovering that every rest stop across 3 states has the exact same people waiting for you. I had the window cracked, a coffee cooling in the cup holder, and the interstate purling east like a promise. A man in a weather-beaten hat leaned by the ice machine. A woman the color of clouded steel held a paper map like it mattered. A younger guy hid behind mirrored lenses that made his face a locked screen, like they've been coordinating your route for weeks. I held the coffee with both hands and told myself not to be dramatic. I should have listened to the voice that tried to crawl up my throat and become action. I learned this during what should have been a simple cross-country move. I had timed the trip, printed confirmations, saved emergency numbers in a note titled Fallbacks. I'd sold the couch with the sunk spot, donated the books I pretended I'd read, packed everything I cared about into my 2020 Honda Accord, a sedan as sensible as a sermon. My name is Ellie So, and this happened 8 months ago. I was leaving Arizona Sunburn for a new job that would bless my inbox with stock options and calendars. I thought I was migrating like a bird, point to point, guided by something old and safe. The road had other plans. The first day was a postcard. Sky like polished glass. Flagstaff's red bones lit with noon. I made the kind of stops influencers recommend. Tourist kiosks with sagging postcards, overlooks where people smile into distances. The first day went perfectly. In Albuquerque, I ate something Childs had set on fire, laughed at nothing in my hotel room, and fell asleep inside the white noise wind of the AC, convinced that adulthood could occasionally be gentle. Morning 2. I left Albuquerque around 8 o'clock in the morning. Highway shouldered with scrub and speed limits. I respected, in the way you respect a fragile truce. I stopped for gas and coffee at a rest area near Santa Rosa, New Mexico. The facility had that carefully neutral architecture, brick, bathrooms, brochures for caves and dinosaur museums. There were maybe a dozen other travelers there, mostly families, and truck drivers taking breaks from the road. And then, hat, gray hair, mirrored lenses, not looking at me. Exactly. Looking through me. The way you glance at a timetable to make sure a train is still arriving when it should. It didn't feel like fear. It felt like a checksum failing. 3 hours later, I stopped for lunch at a rest area near Tucumcari. Bigger building, more vendors, the charm of a controlled habitat. I noticed the same 3 people. They sat far enough away to be polite and close enough to be inevitable. The man in the hat turned away when our eyes touched. My mind tried to fold the coincidence into something reasonable. Maybe there are only so many faces in a country this large. Maybe my brain was caching images and returning them as duplicates. The line moved. The world pretended to be normal. My body did not agree, so I tested the machine. I pulled off the route my calendar loved, took a detour that would cheat any expectation. South, then east, then back toward interstates with different restrooms, different snacks, different lighting, in which faces would surely become other faces. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a white pickup rolled in and bled its doors open. Hat, gray hair, baseball cap. The woman lifted a finger and cut the air between us like thread. Inside the truck stop, the music was synthetic happiness, and the aisles were a catalog of needs. I drifted past novelty mugs and emergency ponchos, catching snatches of conversation like crumbs. I could hear fragments that included references to my car's license plate number and my approximate location. That's when the myth of coincidence collapsed. These people were actively tracking my movements and coordinating with others to monitor my progress across the country. You don't say a plate number by accident. You don't say a name by accident either. And I heard mine, softened by distance and still unmistakable. As if I had become a ticket they were holding, I drove as if the right speed could fix it. I decided to drive to Oklahoma City without stopping again. The sedan a quiet animal, swallowing miles. When I stopped for the night at a hotel near the airport, I saw the same white pickup truck in the parking lot. They had taken the hunter's generosity, leave the prey its illusion of shelter, parked in a spot where they could observe the hotel entrance. I slept like a door that wouldn't latch, every minute a hinge out of square. At dawn, I left without checking out, as if bureaucracy were the net, and escaping it could save me. Arkansas arrived under a high, pale sky. Safety became crowded places, lights that never turned off, cameras with red dots like unblinking eyes. At every stop, I encountered the same pattern, different faces, but the same arrangement. Families that didn't act like families, travelers who never traveled, people at the edges of crowds trying to be the air. A couple near Little Rock asked about my itinerary, with interest too fine-tuned to be friendly. Most disturbing was a stop I made near Memphis, Tennessee, where a man offered me a warning about dangerous areas ahead, like a shepherd offering a safer pasture. When I asked who hired the shepherd, he became fog. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just watching. It was routing. I peeled away from the plan and aimed the car like a dart at Boston, promising myself I would stop only when the tank begged. But even this strategy didn't work. In Nashville, a cluster knew exactly where I was going and when I planned to arrive. They used facts about my life the way a locksmith uses picks. My new job, my apartment lease, times and dates pulled from places I thought were private. Somewhere, my life had been converted into a shared document with commenting turned on. The most frightening encounter happened at a rest area near Lexington, Kentucky. The sky was the gray of a closed lid. I had been reduced to tasks: bathroom, coffee, get back to the car before the world noticed me again. A woman with the posture of an office chair approached, handed me a manila envelope, and stepped back as if she had placed something living in my hands. Inside, a detailed dossier about my life, photographs of my Phoenix apartment framed by lenses I never saw, copies of my employment records, my credit report, stills that caught my profile in different states, like the road had been a photo booth. There was a note with the politeness of a debt collector. I had been selected for a relocation assessment, and my cooperation was required. It proposed an address, rural Kentucky, where representatives would meet me to discuss opportunities superior to the one I had. It read like a customer journey for products that were once people. I threw the envelope in a trash can and got in my car immediately. 3 vehicles slid off their brakes and fell in around me with the choreography of practiced rudeness, never touching, always there. They maintained a loose formation around my car, as if the interstate had painted lanes for them, one ahead, one behind, one in the blind spot that made me check my mirror too often. I tried to exit. They shifted, I tried again. They smoothed me back to the route, like hands smoothing a sheet. For the next 6 hours, I was not driving. I was being delivered. It was like being a sheep guided by border collies. Except the pasture had an address and a pile of bones under it. I pictured the proposed warehouse, a place that had once held goods and now held endings. I pictured my name in a spreadsheet beside status. En route, Louisville saved me by being flawed. I took the city like a dare, dove into rush hour where the human river ran in layers and the air felt stacked with impatience. I scraped into a parking garage whose concrete spiraled like a drain. I left the Honda where anyone would notice if it cried for too long, next to a pillar coated with the stickers of old seasons, and became a person with only a backpack and a credit card. The taxi didn't ask questions. The airport didn't care what the road had done to me. I bought a seat on a plane the way you buy a spare life. Within 24 hours, I was in my new apartment, and every lamp I turned on felt like I was inventing electricity. I didn't go back for the car. I didn't go back for anything the road had touched. The machine that found me could find metal. It could auction my furniture to fund someone else's assessment. I let it all become a ledger entry. When law enforcement pulled the thread, a web came with it. The investigation that followed revealed a method rather than a miracle. The network specialized in intercepting people whose lives were briefly unmoored. Job placement websites, apartment rental applications, shipping orders, forwarding address forms, social posts where you call your next city a fresh start. They had people stationed at rest stop, truck stops, and hotels along major interstate corridors. The faces weren't recurring by chance. They were assigned. The white pickup was a role. The man in the hat, the woman with gray hair, the baseball cap. Actors in a play that had sold out for years. The blueprint was chilling because it was simple. Collect a target's breadcrumb trail from places that pretend to be safe. Track targeted individuals across multiple states, gathering intelligence and looking for opportunities to isolate them in remote locations. Offer help. Nudge the route. The ultimate goal was usually to kidnap people who wouldn't be missed immediately and force them into various forms of labor or exploitation. When they said assessment, they meant market value. Law enforcement officials told me my survival was atypical, not because I was brave, because I was lucky, and because a city's traffic gave me anonymity long enough to run. The address in Kentucky had an abandoned warehouse waiting, connected by rumor and evidence to other endings. Some people from my chain of watchers were arrested. Some were names in files that would take time to ripen into handcuffs. The investigation revealed that the network was much larger than initially suspected. A franchise without a sign. I never retrieved my car. When it was found stripped and abandoned in a rural area of Kentucky, I signed a document that turned the metal and glass into a story the insurance company could understand. My possessions became a negative space in my apartment. The green bowl that used to hold nectarines, the jacket that made me look like someone I wanted to be. But I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have escaped with my life. The agent handling my case used careful words, but didn't hide the math. Very few people who reached that final address were ever seen again. Months later, The interstate still lives in my nerves. I still can't travel on highways without feeling paranoid about being followed. Every rest stop feels like a potential trap. I measure my days in small domestic rituals that say, "You are here." Watering a plant that leans toward morning. Washing a mug until it squeaks like a new sky. I walk to the grocery store, where all the faces are local, and therefore less likely to be scripts. At night, I inventory the facts of my life and try to find something not indexed anywhere. A secret that fits in the space behind a picture frame. The worst part isn't the memory of the convoy, or the envelope, or the eyes behind mirrored glass. The most disturbing realization is how vulnerable we all are during those transition periods in our lives. The moments when the forms you fill out to signal a beginning also announce that you are briefly alone, between nets. We believe we are traveling. They believe we are inventory in motion. Somewhere, someone is always watching the space between leaving and arriving. The place where the country is a long, thin promise, and you are a dot that can be steered. So this is my advice, offered without heroics. Treat your itinerary like a living thing that can be harmed. Never post a route you haven't already taken. Split your nights between places that don't rhyme. Arrange phone calls that ring if you're late. Park where anyone can see you. And when a stranger knows your calendar, treat that knowledge like a fire alarm you cannot silence. The road is beautiful and cruel in equal measure. It never asks who sent you. It only asks how likely you are to be missed. And if you ever see the same faces twice, do what I didn't do fast enough. Become unreadable.